Hi, good morning. So I'm Kristin Trippe. I'm a research microbiologist with the USDA in Corvallis, Oregon. My lab group is been working with biochar for 6 years or so now, and we generally examine how we can use biochar to sustainably intensify agricultural production, mostly by how we can improve soil and microbial function on degraded soils. I've also been involved in several initiatives that coordinate biochar research, both inside the USDA and in external efforts like the one that Jim has coordinated. Like all of the speakers this morning, today I'll be reporting on the recommendations that emerged from the Biomass to Biochar workshop hosted by Washington State University. Specifically, this section of the report originated from a subset of participants that were focused on the use of biochar in agricultural systems. But I'll say that these recommendations that I'm offering today are really similar to conclusions that have emerged from other efforts that I've been involved in. So we've all seen this sort of classic photo of the terra preta soils. And when this started getting a lot of attention, researchers had the idea that we could recreate these soils by just loading them with lots of raw char. But we soon discovered that physiochemical properties matter, and that each biochar has different properties and therefore react with each soil and each crop quite differently. This one biochar, one soil, one climate, one crop relationship resulted in a proliferation of studies, and you can see how that's grown over the years. But despite this continued trend, despite this vast knowledge that we've gained about biochar, we still don't have good recommendations or guidelines to tell farmers where, when, or how much biochar to use. And so I think this is the classic example of drowning in data, but thirsting for knowledge. Meta-analyses have shown time and time again that adding char to soils will, on average, increase yield, but these numbers are much more likely to be achieved in tropical acidic soils, while the benefits of raw char aren't realized in this dramatic fashion in temperate soils. And so what I'd like to talk with you about today is sort of what our working group envisioned as the necessary steps to move from simple demonstration of biochar-based practices in agricultural systems to widespread adoption of biochar-based practices in agricultural systems. To do this, I'll just briefly walk through the barriers that our group identified and then provide you an overview of the pathway or roadmap to overcome these barriers. Our group identified 5 main barriers to the adoption of biochar-based practices in agriculture, and some of these are very related. So as I mentioned, this N by N relationship are still oftentimes poorly understood. And while these relationships have given us a vast amount of research, we still don't know how to predict how a certain char is going to respond in a certain crop, a certain climate, and a certain soil type. There have been some decision support tools that have recently become available that help address this problem, but they're really general and can't accurately capture or predict the benefit of each particular char. So these 2 barriers are obviously interrelated and sort of manifest in this overall barrier, which is that recommendations to farmers about how much to use, when to use, and which biochar to use in different cropping systems have not emerged. Similarly, biochar is quite expensive. And so growers that produce crops with low margins can't justify adding it, even if we have huge increases in crop yield. Yesterday afternoon, someone was talking about a 60% increase in wheat. And that's a crazy observation, and it's amazing. But even then, if you do the economic analysis, farmers still aren't able to afford it. And so if we had programs via the NRCS or other federal agencies, we might be able to improve the value proposition and change the economic dynamics that are preventing the implementation of char-based practices. So what sort of changes could reduce biochar costs, or what changes in policy could improve the value proposition of char, and what breakthroughs could be sort of game changers that put biochar production on a path towards high volume, low cost, and climate friendly production and application. So this figure here is sort of an outline of the heart of the proposal that our working group offered, which is a big idea, but in order to gain momentum, we believe this is what's required. This is a simplified figure that I just tossed together, but it's supposed to represent an integrated system where research is collected in sort of a nationwide long-term field trials, and those data are curated by a national network of researchers who use a global data entry template and an agreed upon set of test methods. These researchers could archive the chars and archive the data so that we can start making large-scale predictions using models about how crops and soils respond to biochar. More important than from these data, these models can better predict crop response to a variety of biochars under a variety of climate conditions in diverse soils. These model predictions may result in a set of first principles that can then be parceled into guidelines for farmers. So this paradigm that I'm showing is really a grand vision for how research can be translated into implementation, but let's break it down a bit because I know it seems a little bit audacious. So I want to talk about this left-hand side of the proposal for a minute, where we're talking about this large-scale biochar long-term trial. There's several long-term nationwide research projects that have really paved the way for this sort of endeavor. GraceNet, which is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction through Agricultural Carbon Enhancement Network, is a perfect example of how something like this works. GraceNet was established 20 years ago and has USDA scientists from across the country asking how changes in management practices can reduce greenhouse gas. Similar to GraceNet, we propose to establish a nationwide network of USDA or land grant research projects that use the best available data to design a common trial across cropping systems, which is what I have labeled here as sort of experiment 1. Now, I'm not actually proposing that these take place in a given region. These are just dots for illustrative purposes, but ostensibly you would have the same type of biochar in each experiment with a regionally important crop. And the same data would be collected from plants, the soils, and the soil microbiome to better understand changes that are induced over the short term and over the long term. Alongside this first experiment in this nationwide network of researchers would design regional experiments that would use a biochar that was specifically matched to address a known deficiency or was based off of a specific feedstock that's really abundant within that region. This could address low pH or metal toxicity, water retention, and so forth. And that experiment would take place in addition to experiment 1. So let's go on and talk about this right-hand side of the proposal, which is meant to help develop prescriptive approaches. So from these experiments, we would develop models and outreach tools based on the results. From this, we could develop a specific set of recommendations for prescriptions for different crops, soils, climates, and so forth. And I think this is really doable because the basis for this already exists. For example, David Laird's group published a model within the program AppSim, which predicts biochar response, and the long-term experiments would go a long way in fine-tuning that model. My group published the Pacific Northwest Biochar Atlas, which is available online for farmers to pair crop requirements with specific biochars that meet those requirements. However, that's based off of nutrition requirements, which again, doesn't really capture the benefits that biochar has to offer. So again, the experiments that we're proposing would go a long way in just filling the existing knowledge gaps in a way that we could develop and refine recommendations to farmers. So how do I accomplish this? And I'm just going to put on my government hat for a minute and argue that this really needs to be seeded through appropriated funding from Congress. And this is because the 2 to 5 year grant cycles that academic scientists rely on really prevents implementation of long-term studies. But the USDA Ag Research Service and other government researchers are really built to handle these sort of long-term experiments. And so research initiatives like long-term agricultural research and GraceNet's sites already use this approach. And here's an example right here of LTAR, long-term ag research and GraceNet sites. So what would it cost? I'm guessing, from my experience, it would be at least $200,000 per year per site. If you had 50 sites, that would come to $10 million a year. So that's, I think, really reasonable. And this would provide a coordinated effort that allows for the formation of networks, which I would argue already exists through ARS CHARNet and other government agency coordinated efforts. It also allows pass-through dollars to floating university partners through non-cooperated assistance agreements, and allows us to work with corporations through commercial research and development agreements. And mostly it harnesses the power and resources and the stability of government agencies. So while this may sound really big and expensive and long-term, I'd like to offer that in all the network meetings I've attended, this is always the answer that we walk away with. We need a networked, nationwide experimental framework that has stable funding and experimental flexibility to answer big questions. And I think it's really doable with stakeholder support. I think we could convince Congress, corporations, and foundations to support such an effort. With that, I know we don't have time for questions, but I'd like to thank my colleagues in the working group and provide you with my contact information and let you know that I'll be here at this session this afternoon. With that, thanks.